Hello everybody, my name is Leonardo de
And I
Waal,
want to see
and
if
I'd like
this
to
is
discuss
working.
something that is relevant in today's EFL classes. Error analysis in hybrid learning. What kind of strategies can we use to help students develop writing accuracy in today's context of online and face-to-face classes? But before we set sail on this journey of mistakes and errors, let's talk about hybrid learning. Hybrid learning is also referred to as blended learning, which integrates face-to-face classroom instruction with online components to provide more personalized learning experiences. However, hybrid learning differs slightly to blended learning in that it first started as a consequence of the COVID-19 lockdown back in 2020. So the approach is more to do with coping with not being able to go to school, as opposed to adding variety in the way you teach. But I will get to the challenges in a minute. So, according to Baringfager, hybrid learning features three main characteristics. So, we're talking about a combination of traditional classroom learning, computer assisted language learning or CAL, and self-directed learning or SDL. Let's have a look at each of them. First, with regards to the traditional classroom, it actually needs no explanation, and I'm sure you're fully aware of the characteristics of the classroom. However, during the pandemic, some things have changed. Classrooms have become more mobile. They've shifted from schools to online classes for periods of times while still retaining the same structure of teacher to student interdependency and language curriculum. This, in turn, has affected the way classes are now being delivered. The next component to hybrid learning is computer assisted language learning or CAL. Now, we all know that CAL is not new. It's been around for over 25 years. And with the speed at which technology evolves comes new inventions and devices. However, despite the fact that new technologies are becoming more accessible, more powerful, smaller, and more portable, the role of these devices in relation to language learning is still the same: to facilitate the process of second language learning. Now, CAL is supposed to integrate technology into the learning process. In other words, it was meant to support face-to-face language instruction in the classroom, not replace it. But as you can see at the moment, quite the opposite appears to be happening. The last component for hybrid learning is self-directed learning, where students set their own learning goals and strategies. They make decisions about how to use available resources, and they also evaluate their own success. Now, here motivation is critical. So the teacher's role is to guide learning by providing scaffolding, mentoring, and advice. Needless to say, however, motivating students behind a screen can be challenging, especially if there are a large number of students seeking the same amount of attention. So now that we know about hybrid learning and what it entails, let's talk about something that many teachers pay little attention to. I'm talking about error correction, which brings about a dilemma in itself. I mean, what should we correct? And before we can answer that question, I would like to discuss what research has to say about errors and mistakes, which some linguists use interchangeably. There are other linguists like Pickford and Carl James who agree that the words errors and mistakes are indeed different, which is important because different errors or different mistakes require different error correction techniques or strategies. So, according to Pickford, the pioneer behind error analysis back in the 1960s, mistakes are errors of performance. That is, they are made during communication. He also believes that the word errors should be associated with deviations that are systematic in nature and that can then show what a student knows about language at any given moment during their learning process, something that he calls transitional competence. The word errors, on the other hand, are given another type of definition, like for instance Carl James, who defines errors as slips made by native speakers. In other words, these are errors that are not made as a consequence of the learning process and can thus be corrected by the speaker without the assistance of the teacher. This process is also known as self-correction. This presentation will focus on mistakes or developmental errors, as they correspond to a study that I carried out some time back. Now, very little information was available in the field of error analysis that studied bilingual schools in Colombia, so I decided to do research about the mistakes that EFL students made. Now, aside from drawing some conclusions from that research that I will share with you today, the study helped me to think about mistakes in general. I mean, we all make mistakes. Among the many facets of human learning, whether it be learning to ride a bicycle or learning to walk, or even the simplest daily task we often take for granted, communicating, learning always requires trial and error. This goes for learning a language as well, only I would call it making educated guesses and mistakes instead. Now, probably the only difference between learning to ride a bicycle and learning a language would lie in the sole notion that with learning a language, mistakes are not only accepted, but in most cases desired. Now, let's think about this for a minute. Nobody wants to fall off a bike and break their arm, but with languages, you'll always have a cushion on which to fall. So I tell my students, hey, make as many mistakes as you can. In fact, the saying we all learn from our mistakes actually makes a great deal of sense, and research nowadays suggests that mistakes are beneficial to language learning. That being said, while desired and expected mistakes are welcome, those that are repeated and recurrent too many times are not. And just like a broken record, they may actually irritate the reader or the listener, depending on the audience. As a language teacher, it would be absolutely impossible to try and tackle each and every mistake students make. Now, I've seen so many teachers fill students' work with scribbles and red ink that not only discourages students, but also wastes teachers' time, because that is actually very impractical. Now, there has always been debate as to which is more important in language learning, fluency or accuracy. Well, some teachers prefer their students to be able to get along in an English-speaking environment. So for them, it's more important to be fluent. Others want their students to be able to use their second language as correct as possible. You may ultimately decide on having a combination of both accuracy and fluency. However, regardless of your decision and teaching philosophy, one thing is certain. Students expect their teacher to correct them. It is part of their job anyway. In my case, I choose accuracy over fluency whenever I'm teaching writing, because I believe students need to be challenged so that my guidance as a teacher, with my guidance, they can venture beyond Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. So, as a part of the process to improve writing accuracy, I have focused on a specific type of mistake that appears to have become fossilized. I call these mistakes careless English mistakes. And these mistakes, not errors, bear the following characteristics. 1. These mistakes are made due to cross-linguistic influence. 2. These errors tend to backslide, and they're caused because of transfer between the first language and the target language. Backsliding, by the way, is the reoccurrence of the mistake after after this grammar component was taught, so they're made again in the future. Local errors that I've discussed early on, which is errors that do not impede communication. They're very small and minor. Non-developmental errors, which are the mistakes that are not caused due to the lack of knowledge. So they're not made because students are ignorant of a rule. 5, they are systematic and self-corrigible. So systematic is because the students have adopted or invented the rule for themselves. Because they have not been corrected, they now believe that it's okay to say it or write it that way. And last but not least, and more importantly, I would believe, is the lack of proofreading. Students just, don't take the time to go back, check their work, and see if there are any mistakes that can be avoided before submitting their work. Okay, so just before we move on, I'd like to say that in my research, the mistakes that I identified and worked on were local errors, not global errors, which are terms proposed by Burt and Kiparsky in 1975. In essence, local errors are minor, almost unnoticeable errors that don't compromise the clarity of the message that the speaker or writer wants to get across. On the other hand, global errors are more serious mistakes and they actually impede communication. That said, I did say I was going to share some of the conclusions of my research. Well, here are some of my findings. When asked who they thought, and this is with the 9th graders, when asked who they thought was responsible for the correction of mistakes, 76.6% stated that it was the teacher's responsibility. This led me to believe that students may not always proofread and might actually rely on the teacher to do it for them, when the teacher gives them feedback. In another question, I asked them about error correction in the past and present, and how they would like to be given feedback in the future. 35.7%, the majority, told me that they were used to having the teacher encircle the mistake without providing them with the answers. The next slide told me that they didn't like that at all, and they actually preferred to be corrected by having the teacher identify the mistake and correct the mistake by giving them the answer. This might benefit some students, but it is at the expense of critical thinking and the use of metalinguistic awareness, as the teacher might just, the teacher would just spoon feed them with the answers. What I tend to do is give them the answer only if there are global errors in the text, and provide them with some hints when there are local errors. These hints could be in the form of different colors or perhaps some sort of symbols or conventions that they are familiar with. Finally, here are some results from the database of errors that I have in Excel. This sample is taken from a total of 1,300 mistakes collected over almost 10 years. This is the most common type of semis. I'm simply going to name the mistakes. I won't explain how the mistakes were made in this presentation due to time constraints. The most common type of mistake recorded in my corpus of local errors is what I call the phonetically interchanged triple, PIT, which are the confused or interchanged use of is, the verb to be in the third person, it's, a contraction of it and is, and its, third person possessive pronoun. The second most common semi are the misuse of articles. In other words, the use of definite articles and the lack of them in certain sentences. So some of them are overused while others are not. And in the last place we have the word where, which is generally confused with the word were. Now, as you know, error correction takes time and continuity, and this leads me to the challenges that hybrid learning has with regards to error correction. Though there may be a lot more, these are some of the most notable challenges that I have seen myself. First of all, there's an interruption in the learning process. At times, Schools have had to shift their classes from schools to video conferencing software like Teams and Zoom due to the COVID-19 lockdowns. And this interrupts the proper flow of the class and makes keeping track of students' progress a lot harder. Imagine you're doing in-class reading with your students and then told that you had to carry on with this process online the following day. Now, this is even more challenging if you've got younger kids. Time is also an issue. Error correction is a time-consuming job, and even more when it comes to using a computer. Something else that I've noticed is that students prefer face-to-face feedback as opposed to the impersonal online approach. Online classes seem a little bit more distant and unaffectionate at times, when you can't even see the students' faces because some of them won't turn on their cameras. I feel that students are also thrown into the deep end. I feel that some of them are unprepared to use new apps or have very poor ICT skills and can't even afford a laptop or a computer at home. Something else that I've seen is that there have been less or no group activities online, which makes peer correction practically impossible. Something else that I've noticed is that initial planning does not really deal with the online classes or the issues that we have about the need for online classes today, and neither does the curriculum. Finally, at home, it has been known that students become easily distracted, which may actually affect written accuracy. These challenges have changed the way we teach and even the way we deliver feedback or do error correction. As part of the strategies to face these challenges, I have some practical suggestions that may work for you. These strategies depend primarily on your student's age group, their level of English, the school policy and language, and even the amount of patience that you have and the time that you have available. I think it's important that you decide what you want to correct. And I would suggest that you focus on one aspect of language. So it could be grammar, vocabulary, or punctuation, etc. Also decide what type of coded or uncoded feedback you would like to use. So if it's coded, it could be the use of colors, underlining mistakes, or symbols, all of which are very good for local errors. And try to be consistent throughout the year so that students can slowly get used to them and understand them. I would also suggest that you set up and share a Word document online. This will allow for continuity and progress when shifting classes to online platform. You will be able to, you will have another a benefit, and that would be that you would be able to monitor students' progress live. So the first page of this document could have the rubric and the writing directions for the students. The second page could be left for the students to write the draft or the first submission of their text for formative assessment. The third page would be left for a final submission, which you would grade. And the last page could be a space allocated for students, for a student's self-assessment form, where students can be given the chance to reflect about their personal learning based on the feedback that was given. When it comes to written corrective feedback, I would suggest that you use the comment feature in Microsoft Word to address global errors. I would also recommend that you write a short, encouraging but realistic comment about the overall text, including the positive aspects and also ways that the student can improve. I would also allow I would allow students to use class time to correct the work and not just leave everything for homework, where they will have to depend on non-bilingual parents. I mean, they can benefit much more by having you as a teacher help them in the classroom. Okay, well, that's about it for today. But if you'd like to contact me to discuss any of these issues further, I'd be delighted to hear from you. So don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Bye-bye.